Welcome to another Sunday Superversive live stream. I am your host, Benjamin Wheeler, and today we are discussing just some interesting ideas that we thought about as, discussions of what we should talk about. The big thing right now is that we're thinking about what's called the Benedict option, which is the separation of the Christian from the world around him, the creation of Christian communities. We have not read The Benedict Option by Rod Dreher. Personally, I think that while one can certainly try to make a city on a hill, that separation from the world is impossible. But Anthony, my lovely co-host, my darling co-presenter, my absolute mad lad of a Chad, uh, I don't know. Like, what do you think about it, Anthony?
So my main problem is I would really need to read the book. I'm looking at the poor reviews of it to see what they are, and the poor reviews are bad. And what this makes me think is that even if you disagree, this is probably a book worth reading. You
Yep.
know, like n- I'm trying to give you an idea of why it's bad. Like it's a long review. It is grammatically correct, which actually makes me happy because that means that the person who did this uh is
Literate.
somebody who like isn't just a troll. They just fundamentally misunderstood what they were reading or are wrong about a great many things. Like Rod Dreher says to pull your children out of public schools. I consider this so obvious as to be almost tautological at this point. Like public schools are evil. Why are you sending your children there? Uh and I hate like if you're somebody who's listening and you're like, well, my children go to public schools, it's like I don't mean to be rude, but you really shouldn't be sending them there. Like, figure something out.
Right.
This is very, very bad at this point, right? Uh and not that all private school options and all or homeschool whatever, like not that they're all created equal, but they're gonna be a better option than the public school system nearly every single time, right?
Mm-hmm.
Uh,
That part I feel most Christians have no real argument against, partially because it's um, how do I want to put it? How many children have to be eaten by the grist meal before you realize, maybe these public schools are a waste of my tax money, a waste of my time, you know, actively destroying the children that I have brought forth into the world. It's hard
mhm,
to um, it's hard to say that you really care for your children if the second that it's convenient for you, you throw to people who want to destroy them.
yeah, I don't know. So in terms of, let me give you like what I'm gonna call the cartoon idea of the Benedict option, because again, I want to be very fair in saying I haven't read the book, so I don't know how Dreher, who's the writer by the way, Rod Dreher,
Mm,
I don't know how Dreher nuances it,
right.
right? Like so, but the cartoon idea of the
Are you there, Anthony? Oh no, we've lost him. He does bring up a good point that there is a difference between the rhetorical idea of a Benedict option and a non-rhetorical, the dialectic. The dialectic is almost always more complex than the dialectic view of any of something like this is much more complex than the rhetorical. Separation from the world is easy to say if you know you're not actually willing to put out a strategy for it. Am I? What is going on? Anthony, where are you? My man. Oh, right. Laptop randomly went black. All right. Uh, well, that's you know. Uh, anyway, the rhetorical view of the Benedict option is always going to be different from the dialectic. But the question is, how do you view separation from the world? For the Christian, we have two different sort of mindsets that can be uh, thought through. One of them is that we are supposed to be separated from the world. Um, we are supposed to be not some sort of uh, we are not to be indistinguishable from the unsaved. I'll put it like that. We are supposed to have oh huh that's interesting. We are supposed to have a different character, a different life, a different spirit that fills us and causes us to act differently than the unsaved around us. They are
Do,
supposed
do,
to look
do.
at us. Sup, Anthony? They are supposed to look at us and see Christ through us, the Spirit of Christ. And that always, it's not a thing you can scientifically put down, but it does, it's something that you have to consider. Then you have, uh, what am I thinking of? Then you have the Great Commission. So on one hand, you have separation from the world. On the other hand, you have go forth to the world and preach the gospel. So in other words, what is the sweet spot between being separate from the world and being uh, you know preaching the gospel? For example, if you think of something like the Cathars took separation from the world as completely as I can comprehend. Almost, Buddhist would I think be a similar one, where they had incredible cleanliness and they separated themselves from all corruptions and stuff like that. Of course, they were heretics. Of course, they were cultists, so they never actually did it. But what they said they were, they said that they were separated from the world and that they were perfect. But at the same time, they never left their home region in France, really. Then you look at something like um, the Moravians and Methodists and Baptists, and the Catholics as well. And they went all over the world preaching the gospel. But it's pretty clear that the Methodists never really cleaned out the modern corruption in their ranks, which of course affected them sending out as many missionaries as before. And now they send so many less. But you see how this is. At one point, things like the Baptists and the Methodists, were actively seeking unreached tribes in the Amazon to reach them with the gospel. But now, we can't culturally impose on these naked cannibalistic savages. That would be absolutely horrible. To destroy their native culture of demon worship. Uh, so where is that sweet spot? If we only separate from the world, we do not preach the gospel in the manner that Christ represented. Christ preached the gospel. He preached himself to whoever happened to be there, whoever happened to listen. And as a Christian who witnesses, I promise you it's much easier than described. Most people are not offended by Christ until you start making some hard statements about what a Christian is and isn't. And even then, there's not like you'll face any violence in America. And even in places like England, except in the worst Muslim ghettos, except at the hands of the police. So you see where it goes there. But then at the same time, we have to protect our kids um, from the corruption of things like the public schools. And I want to be clear, there was a movement in my childhood and probably into Anthony's childhood as well, where it's like, we'll send them out as witnesses to public school kids. And almost immediately, it turned out that the public school kids are going to corrupt your kids. Guaranteed every time. I know that the second I went into even a slightly more secular Christian school than the one I came from, people were automatically talking about masturbation, about chicks, about sex. And these were, Christian, this was a Christian school with people who had been raised in Christian families. Not good Christian families, not strong Christian families like mine was, but supposedly Christian families. Now, fortunately, the worst of them, I am pleased to report, has continued to, well, I'm not pleased to report that he's continued to reject Christ, but he is a homeless vagrant, last I was told anything about him. So, his wickedness has come to roost. But at the same time, it's like, what? I didn't know what to say at that time. In the end, I just sort of fell back on my dad's strategy and just shut it down. I'm like, I'm not going to talk about this. It got to the point at the end where I started getting violent to people who would talk to me like that. Fortunately, I was never brought to any, issues, any trouble, legal or otherwise. But I got into a few fights, not a few fights. I shouldn't say this. I got into a fight over it, and the rest of the time I was able to leave. But it's you know, like they affected me, I could not affect them. And you'll find that children are unable to spread the gospel unless they are divinely inspired to. Uh, that's sort of my statement about that. Like you can never really have a Benedict option if your children are interacting with the world. You can never separate yourself from the world as long as, you have children who are interacting with the world. You can surround them with a community that loves them and engage in harsh moral training, but you have to be able to put in, you have to be willing, not able. I shouldn't say able because everyone is able. You have to be willing to put in the moral training, the reading the Bible every day, the praying and stuff like that. And it's not something that you can give to a priest, pastor, Sunday school teacher, whatever. You yourself, the parent, have to do it. It's the only thing that kept me in the church as a child and into my young adult years. My dad's demand that we, read the Bible together in the morning. Uh, I don't know your experience, Anthony, but that's sort of a look at my experience.
Yeah, well, I mean, if we're going on like what kept us in the faith or from leaving the faith or whatever, uh I was a little bit different. Like, so, you grow up like there's this cultural sort of inertial Catholicism,
Yes.
right? Which is the thing that gets I think so much of the vitriol from especially like the very in your face type of evangelical Protestants, and deservedly so. Uh, so I was part of a family that was like in this inertial phase of Catholicism. Uh, honestly, we didn't even really like as a child. I remember denominational differences weren't particularly important. Like we were Catholic because my family just happened to be Catholic, and there were no Catholic church nearby. We would have gone to a different church and whatever. Uh, that was like the attitude. So this didn't really change. So I went to a Catholic high school, and part of it was just interacting with you're in high school. That's the period of time where you start asking, start trying to think for yourself and asking these questions and going, hey, why am I just assuming that all of this stuff that I formerly believed was true? Now, that's why, I feel like a lot of atheists, and sorry, atheist friends, but I feel like a lot of atheists are stuck in the high school stage. It all feels very childish to me a lot of the time. Not for nothing, Uh, but you have childish, uh, this childish attitude of questioning things, and I had a theology teacher who was really, really good at answering questions. And also, I just started doing my own research and coming to my own conclusions. Like, one thing that I vividly remember is like being talked into essentially being pro life, right? Like,
Right.
if you had asked me entering high school, if I was pro-life, I would have said, like, I don't know, I guess maybe not in cases of rape or incest. I don't really think about it that much, you know. Uh, and I probably would have ended up not being pro-life forever. And then a speaker came in. Now, speakers in high school are often, you know, much maligned, but and again with some justification. But I remember the speaker. She gave an impassioned pro-life argument to our assembly of students, to which I appreciate the school for bringing her in. And at the end of the argument, it was sort of like I really could not think of. She had answered any possible response I could possibly have had to be pro-choice, and I felt that if I were going to be honest with myself and logically consistent, I would need to be pro-life. And this ended up being how I felt to this day, right? Like, I've always said this about like the bigger issue with the pro-choice position is it's worse than just being evil. It's not just that being pro-choice evil, it's that it's really dumb. Like, there is nothing. There is absolutely nothing underpinning the pro-choice position. It's not even really good rhetoric, right?
Right.
It's just it's emotional rhetoric.
Right.
Like, it's not high level rhetoric. It's not clever. It's not trickery. It's just, you know, you don't want to see a 12-year-old child raped, do you? And it's so nothing. It's so vacuous. You know, like if you set down, if you put aside your emotions for a second, it completely falls apart. Like, completely. There is nothing there. And that was just, you know, learning about Christianity, learning about Protestantism and Catholicism, and I left high school and I was Catholic, and then there's more from there. So yeah, I ended up Catholic because, in summary, I did some of my own research, but I had a really good theology teacher. Uh, who was willing to answer all of my questions. Like, I would approach him after class and I would literally like stay for like 10 minutes after class and grill him with questions, and I got a reputation for it. But you know, that sort of thing is important, right?
Yep.
By the way, if you notice that my volume and voice sounds worse, my laptop is acting weird and is making me think I will probably need to replace it, which is what it is. Laptops don't last forever. Uh, because now twice it just randomly shut down on me, so I am talking through my phone. Anyway, going back to what I was originally going to say about the original Benedict option, like the cartoon version of the Benedict option is that like you and a bunch of homeschoolers move together to a community where you completely separate yourself, only buy from your neighbors and don't do anything. And my understanding is that that is sort of what he's getting at, but I don't know the ways that he nuances it, so I don't want to say for sure that that's like the entire thing. Uh, with that said, I I agree with you in that I think there needs to be some sort of hybrid option, right? Like there needs to be something a little bit more, a little bit better uh than just the trying to think of how to put it. There needs to be something a little bit better than just separate yourselves and don't contact the outside world. Because, like you said, there's the Great Commission. There's, yeah, we can't entirely separate ourselves. In the end, I've been coming more and more along to like Matt Fradd's view of find yourself a bubble and live there. But excuse me, you know, Matt Fradd has a very public radio show or whatever you want to call it, right? YouTube show that he runs on a large platform with over 300,000 followers. He goes to events, right? He is
Yep.
constantly interacting with the world. And even if you wouldn't normally see him, like he's certainly allowing you to see him, right? He's not hiding himself from the
Mm-hmm.
secular world. Uh, and I think that that needs to be sort of the approach we'll take. Like, and also be very careful with children, right?
Yes.
This is where the whole thing, right? Like you were saying earlier, uh, this is like what you were saying earlier with that whole movement of like put children in schools to evangelize. That's absolutely insane. Uh, like it is so absurd. Children are not capable of doing that. Like
Yep.
unless with the rare exception maybe of certain saints. Like I have in the back of my mind, I have like there was a saint named Saint Dominic Savio who Saint John Bosco, who was an educator, worked with. Like, yeah, okay, I guess if you sent Saint Dominic Savio into the schools, he would probably do a good job. But he was literally, a saint. But most children are not going to be capable of doing that. I
Mm-hmm.
absolutely was not capable of doing that. I did not know anybody who was capable of doing that, to be frank. Uh,
Yep.
like I've never met somebody who would be capable of going into the schools as a child and evangelizing the world. When you're at that age, the opinions of your friends are so important to you. And this is where it becomes, that's just how it is. You like, if you're a parent, it's a problem, uncomfortable, you got to accept it, right? You need to accept that that's how it is, and it's your job as the parent to make sure that they are interacting with good people,
Yep.
right? With good, wholesome people. So yeah, I think let's call the option, I'm gonna call it the Matt Frad option. So this is a discussion of, it's kind of a companion to that discussion we had with academic aging, because that was a discussion we had about how we would form our ideal society. Like, if we had a chance to go ground up, what would we do, right?
Right.
Uh, this is a little bit different, but it's related. We can't do that right now. It's not practical, right?
Yes.
It just isn't. So, what should we do? What can we do? Now, this doesn't necessarily mean what should we do literally this second. In fact, it doesn't mean that, because I can't do it this second. But what should we do, like, before we die? You know, what should we do before too much time has passed and life has moved on around us? And I think that the answer is to form a bubble, right? We'll call this the Matt Frad option, because he's the one I've seen express this opinion the most. I'm sure he did not originate it. But I've heard him talk about it the most, so I'm going to call it the Matt Frad option. So the Frad option is find a bubble of like-minded people and stay with them. This does not mean that you don't ever interact with the outside world. It doesn't mean that you don't evangelize, and it doesn't mean that you don't put yourself out there in the public eye. But what it does mean is that when you are coming home to an environment where the people around you are people you can trust to at least be trying to be moral, right?
Right.
That they are making the effort to be moral, in a way that is that you would approve of. Like, to be frank, like Matt Fred has mentioned, he's talked about, he lives in Steubenville, which is the Franciscan University of Steubenville is there. It's sort of turned into like the center of Catholic culture in the U.S., which is really weird. Like, Matt talks about living there a lot, that he loves it, or I should say, Matt Frad, because we're not on a first name basis. Right? Frad
Right.
talks about living there a lot, right? How much he likes it there and things like that. But he's very honest about it. He's like, it is a rust belt down where we've been approached by like meth addicts on the streets. Like, one time a homeless person stumbled into my home. I had to call the police. Like, he's very honest about it. And yet people, because of Pints with Aquinas, he's talked about this. People have started flocking to Steubenville. And he loves this. He's like, I think it's great that we're doing this. I think that more people should come here, right? Like, just make sure that you know what you're getting into. This is not
Yep.
a paradise, right?
Yep.
Like, I'm not selling you a paradise. I am selling you a community, right? This is a community of people. He mentions like that one thing he mentioned, like, one of the reasons that Franciscan is so different from other colleges, they mention, is that Franciscan, the peer pressure is to be holier, right? They go, not that
Yes.
everybody there is always holy, but that in other schools the peer pressure is to be immoral, and at Franciscan the peer pressure is to be holier, right? Like, if you're
Mm-hmm.
not going to, mass, if you're not praying or whatever, like, your friends are going to be like, hey man, why haven't you been to church lately, right? Like, that's the atmosphere that they create there. So, and it's made me think, like, maybe one day I'll end up moving to Steubenville, which is weird for me to say because I hate the cold. Uh, and it's in Ohio, and I'm already live in New Jersey, which is already pretty cold, and in the winters. And yet, I think that there is something to, like, you should find a community. You should find a community of people that you trust, and you should go there, and that should be your base. And that should be who you surround yourselves with. And when you interact with the world, it should be from that base. And I think that's how I would put it. Have that base. And in a sense, that is the Benedict option, because you go to, like, the Benedictine monks. Father Weta and talked about this.
Mm-hmm.
So Father Weta, by the way, who we've interviewed 3 times, he was just on Pints with Aquinas, which was it was a very funny, very entertaining interview that anybody who liked our interviews with him, I highly recommend you watch it. It's great. So uh, anyway, going to Father Weta, he talks about he is a Benedictine monk, right? Like, he's
Mm.
actually a Benedictine monk. He took the literal Benedict option. Uh, he took the Benedict option harder than Rod Dreher ever did. And however, Augustine Weta appears on our show 3 times. He appeared on Matt Fradd's show. He leads retreats. The difference is, and he said this on Matt Fradd's show. If you listen to the interview, the difference is he has a home base that he goes back to, right? Like, he's like, this is the monastery is where I am rooted, right? I can go out and do these things, but I'm always going back to this spot, right? This is my spot.
Right.
That's the difference. That's so. I think when you talk about, like, the Bandic option, in a sense, I think that's how you need to approach the world. You need to approach the world of having that community around you, and it's hard. It's hard to find that community. America has a culture of extreme individualism that has been glorified in our films and our, and in
Mm.
our books, and is made to look very attractive. Think of the Western, right?
Right. And
Now,
there's, in the same spirit, led missionaries solo, around the globe, like Nate Saint and Jim Elliot. But at the same time, we're not sending out that many missionaries as we should. Uh,
no, nobody is. The
yeah.
Catholics aren't. The Protestants aren't. Like, we all need to get our act together. But just generally speaking, where you go, like, we have this culture of extreme individualism, and we glorify it in America. And it's so glorified that conservatives will even glorify it, right? Like, people who mostly, I'll put it this way. I know that conservative has become like a buzzword, but I don't know how else to put it. Give me a form. People who mostly agree with us. How
Yes.
about that? Right? Uh, People who mostly agree with us on a lot of these larger points will believe in this form of extreme pull yourself up by your bootstraps individualism, right? And yeah, even in our cinema, like, the best cowboy cinema, if you talk about westerns, right, will
Mm-hmm.
show you the folly of it. I'm thinking specifically of The Searchers and True Grit as 2 really good examples. Where The Searchers is about Ethan, who is an extreme individualist, right? But
Yes.
he is a mean, nasty person. And it is very clear if you watch the movie that he can never have the life of family and, right, and
Mm-hmm.
connections that the rest of his relatives has, but he wishes that he could live that sort of life. He is not capable of it, but this is a defect in him, right? And that's
Yes.
one of several reasons that The Searchers is such a brilliant movie. And it is a brilliant movie, by the way. You should see it if you haven't. Uh, and the other movie I'm thinking of is the Coen Brothers version of True Grit. Now, the original 1969 True Grit, the one starring John Wayne, did not have this ending. It took out what you might consider the epilogue of True Grit. But this is in the book. This is in the Coen Brothers movie. And it's one of several reasons that the Coen Brothers movie is absolutely the superior way to experience the story. Is also, and this is very controversial because the book is popular, I think that the True Grit movie is better than the Coen Brothers version of the True Grit movie is better than the book. Uh, but at the end of the movie, Maddie Ross is an old woman. She is alone. She goes to meet Rooster Cogburn, who has been performing in some sort of traveling Old West show. and Rooster Cogburn has died alone before she could see him. And that's just and the last line of the story is time just gets away from us. So Maddie is shown as being, which is a terribly sad final line, right?
Yes.
Uh, it's a terribly sad ending. Uh, but it's a brilliant ending. It is a brilliant ending because it shows that this incredible individualism that led Maddie to do all of these terrible things and led or all of these incredible things, I mean not terrible. And this rugged individualism that led Rooster to have the sort of grit that allowed him to survive in the West ultimately led Maddie to be miserable and alone and Rooster to die a shell of his former self, performing in parodies of his old life, right?
Mm.
So it's the even in our culture, like the best westerns will show the miserableness, but still, it's taken place in our culture. I could talk about where I live now. It's a nice neighborhood. It's a nice town. I like it here. However, I don't know my neighbors like at all.
Yep.
And this is just seen as like you wouldn't know your neighbors. You would just not, that would be we don't do that here sort of
Right.
thing, right? But you
It's
should, right? You really
yeah.
should, ideally. You should, and that doesn't necessarily mean you shouldn't get to know the people who are always immediately around you, but you should be in a community where the people around you know each other. You should be rooted in a home. It should be a home in that way. That's
Hmm.
my thoughts on this whole thing. I don't know if I don't know if that's not going to be the easy answer people want, right? Uh,
Right. Like there's no
it's not going to solve your problems.
right. There's no glamour to it. But then again, if you're here, you've probably chosen the Christian life. Like I can tell you, my neighbors interacting with them have mostly been negative ever since I moved out of the family house. My downstairs neighbors at the old apartment kept screaming at each other all day at any hour, and the guy above me will stamp his foot anytime I close the door in a way he doesn't like. Uh, you know, to a disturbingly crazy amount actually. So it's like I don't even know. I try to interact with other neighbors, and it's just kind of a hello goodbye sort of thing. It's it is how we are right now. Uh, but see how we'll see how the future goes. Like there's always opportunities, new neighbors, new movements, and stuff like that. And bringing them to Christ would be pretty swell. Uh, but I don't know. Part of the thing that we're dealing with right now is that there's no like a lot of the church movements, are clearly in need of reformation. From the Catholic recent document that was immediately used by James Martin to bless some homosexual couples, no matter what people are saying about it. Uh, to the continued apostasy of the Methodists and the Lutherans. And the Lutherans are completely borked. Um, they've been, entirely consumed by, leftists and leftist allied types, which I've known even before it was obvious because their director of children's ministries was a known homosexual who uh, mentally abused my sister when they dated, or after they dated, I should say. So it's yeah, no, it's no shock, it's no surprise. It turns out when you don't gatekeep your institutions in a way that's appropriate, you just get taken over by Satan. It's not even a pithy proverb. It's just the rule of law. If you don't gatekeep, you get taken over. Your Mott and Bailey will be conquered. Don't you know your ad hominem will be molested? Um, your slippery slope fallacy will fall faster and faster. Uh, so on and so forth. Um, it's no shock. The good people died off, and they never really were able to pass on, from their good generation to, the generation of our parents. And our parents certainly, except in, rare occasions, never were able to pass on good Christian teaching. Though, it's not all that crazy a situation. It just takes people by surprise every time it happens. Um, Before, certain awakenings, people were completely fallen away from God, especially before some of the movements that took London by storm. People barely understood, knew who Jesus was, um, Catholic or Protestant or otherwise. Then you had, a lot of what went on in France and whatnot with the Enlightenment. Like, at some point they refuse to gatekeep their institutions. They refuse to, make sure that people were of the right mindset. They didn't lock away Voltaire, and all this other stuff that they probably could have done to kill the Enlightenment. But at the same time, it's like, the what took over Paris and what took over France was entirely supported not only by men like Robespierre, but men of the church, of the academies, and even the nobility that they were sending to the guillotines. It's no that's that they weren't just supported by some sort of mob. They were actively supported by the elite institutions of France. So there wasn't really an escape when a few of the counties of France broke away. They were crushed by one of the most horrible campaigns of left-wing terror that has ever been. If you want to know about it, an academic agent. Um, Hold on a second. Let me get his name because it's a really good video. He did Stephen Carson did a video on what's called left wing terror. Turns out, uh, the left has been, using terror tactics for quite some time. Uh, France was not an exception. Modern stuff was not an exception. The Unabomber was simply a part of a larger strain of left wing bombs being put around the country. When will Wendigoon do a Weatherman, deep dive or whatever?
Yeah, I don't know.
It's not
It's
studied.
all very
It's what it is.
it yeah, it all is what it is. I guess that's the best way to put it, because I'm trying to think of how to word it and I can't think of anything besides that. Which is boring, so sorry everyone. Uh yeah, in terms of like what should we do now, I guess though. Uh I am happy with my answer. How about that? Uh it's the only answer I could really think of,
Yeah.
which is find like-minded people and stick with them.
Yep. And
And
that's
the other thing too, sorry, I'll finish this point, then you can go. Like the other thing too is like how concerned should you be that the people around you are either Catholic or Protestant or whatever, right? And I think the answer is that is for another time to worry about. Uh, I've kind of reached that point, and I don't know if who would or would not agree with me. Like, I went on a retreat and I actually asked a question that was somewhat similar to this. to one of the priests on retreat. And in fact, I'll mention this was Father Gregory Pine is who I asked this question of, who was at the retreat. And it was something to the effect of, like, I said something like, Father, if I am ever asked about, like, Protestants, I'm in discussions with them, like, what how worried should I be about, like, converting them or whatever? Because what I always say is that I think that you need to be honest. So if you genuinely don't think you should be Catholic, you shouldn't. And his response was an interesting one. It was something along the lines of, I don't think that you should necessarily be depending upon sincerity to judge people. Uh, and while I understand his point to an extent, I've been thinking over his response, and there is still something to, like, it's not so easy for me to just go that this question of should you be Catholic or Protestant or Orthodox is so easy that I can only assume that anybody who is not Catholic must in some way, like, have some sort of defect. Like, that is not how it comes off to me. There are
Mm,
certain people on all sides of the divide who it does look that way to them, right? You'll
right.
find Protestants who are very, very, like, like, obviously you wouldn't be Catholic. You'll find Catholics who will feel exactly the same way. I just can't honestly think that way. So, like, if, to be honest with you, like, if you were to ask me, so are you really 100% certain that the Catholic Church is the true church between, two? I would go, no, I'm not 100% certain. I don't think you need to be 100% certain of anything to act, though, right? Uh, like, I'm certain enough that I think other people should be Catholic, but I am not 100% certain. For that matter, I would say I'm really not 100% certain even that Christianity is true, but yes, I am more certain that Jesus Christ rose from the dead and the prophecies he preached were true than that the Catholic Church is the exact continuation of, like, what he started, right?
Mm,
I'm more certain of the former than the latter, if I'm being honest. So, going to what I should do if I'm forming a community, right? Like, or if I'm finding a community in this case. Should I prioritize living with fellow Catholics specifically? And I would answer that I would say I think that in the long run that's going to be necessary, because we know from history that when these things start to shake out, the differences become more pronounced when you don't have the secular world in the background, kind of.
yes.
Uh, but in the position that we're in right now, it's hard for me to say that, like, okay, so we don't agree about the Catholic Church, if it's the church that Jesus Christ specifically found, like, if it's a direct continuation and there's no other continuation or not. But both of us agree that we should be trying to follow Christ. So I can
Mm,
have nothing to do with you. I'm not so convinced of that. I think you got to prioritize having people around you who you know will have your back when the wolves come to the door. And right now, Protestants are not the wolves, and neither are faithful Catholics, for that matter. You'll
yeah.
find wolves in sheep's clothing in both of the traditions, but when you're talking about the wolves, like the people, the predators who are out to get you, if you're a Catholic, it's not Protestants, and if you're a Protestant, it's not Catholics. That's
Yep.
my 2 cents.
And it's yeah. Like with do check out what I linked in the description, guys. Stephen Carson's a good egg from St. Louis. Knows his stuff. Worth watching, especially the Left Wing Terror series. The Great Martyrdom is pretty 10 out of 10. Uh, yeah, and it's why I try to stay very ecumenical about things. Like when it comes down to it, I do have very strong opinions about Catholicism and Catholic teaching and how they treat Jesus Christ and stuff like that. But the part of the but what I do, to defend myself against uncharitable thoughts is to make sure, What is the witch test? What is the shibboleth that I can use to ensure I'm not dealing with some Catholic who doesn't understand the friend enemy distinction at this time, and will in fact
Mm-hmm.
attack me when my back is turned or when it's convenient for him. It's to see how he treats Jesus Christ. The fact is that people like to talk about how people are converting from Protestantism to Catholicism, but you know there's not the same amount of people saying the opposite. Not because it's not happening. I go to church with several people who converted from Catholicism and brought their families with them. It's that this isn't something to crow about. Uh,
Mm.
it's not the right call to say, well, you know, there's 10 million Christians, there's 10 million Catholics in China, and I'm reading the same document and it says that there's 50 million Protestants in China, growing every day. Catholics and Protestants. China's going to be Catholic in, 2035. No, it's not going to be Catholic in 2035. It's not going to be Protestant in 2035 either. The government will, subvert and take over and murder and kill like they always do. And quite frankly, it's I wouldn't want China to adopt any sect of Christianity as part of its mainline thing, because that will mean there'll be a million Chinese grifters trying to take over. They had a grifter who said he was the brother of Jesus Christ, and he killed like 30 million people with all the wars that they had. Like there's things to rejoice over, but mass movements should always be viewed with suspicion. It's pretty clear that
Pretty sure. I think that the conversion going on in China, the mass conversion to Christianity, I think it's genuine. Do I
yes.
think China will be majority Christian by 2035? Um,
Well, no,
I
that's I'm
think
just saying
that
what the rhetoricians say.
right.
As
Well,
Owens
what
and
I'm
Gacho
saying,
on Twitter.
because that's the current trajectory. I think that assumes too much about the current trajectory. You
Yes,
know what I mean? Like it assumes that the
I
current
agree.
trajectory is going to continue the way it is, which we have no clue if that's the case or not.
Yeah.
Uh, and considering that we don't know that's the case, I don't know how you could possibly say that. Uh, yeah, I'm thinking it over right now exactly how this would go. So I, I think we do need to remember that Christianity has conquered countries has conquered countries before and can conquer countries again, and in fact it will conquer countries again. We know, for
Mhm.
example, that Israel will one day convert to Christianity. That doesn't necessarily mean the modern nation state of Israel, but nevertheless, uh, Israel, Israel is one get Israel, the Jewish people, are one day going to be converted to Christianity. This is prophesied in the New Testament.
Mhm.
So Christianity can conquer nations. And Christianity thrives under martyrdom. Now, some of
Yes.
the Eastern nations, specifically Japan, Cambodia, Thailand, they managed to kind of halt Christianity in its tracks by realizing, uh, looking at the examples of the Romans and realizing that if you publicly assassinate Christians, that will galvanize them. So they started doing it privately, and then they would get their leaders to apostatize in order to, you know, crush their faith. This is what
Mhm.
the movie and the book Silence is about, and it's a terrifying story. And I don't know. It's very hard to figure out what to make of the ending. If it's optimistic or not. If it's good. If it's bad. All of that stuff, right? Uh, but yeah, it's a very terrifying story. Some of those Asian countries did figure it out to like that extent. But
Yep.
all of that said, not all of them did. For one thing, Vietnam, for example, has, I don't know if it's a majority Christian, but it has an extremely large Christian population. India as well has a thriving Christian community. It didn't convert entirely, like the whole country wasn't totally transformed, but the Christian community never went away.
Yeah.
Uh, it's there, it's thriving. Vietnam as well. I believe Thailand also has a Christian community. Cambodia managed to get to drive it out, and Japan famously managed to drive it out. So now it's just like stragglers that
Yeah.
are there right now, and a few very tiny missionary groups. China was one of the groups that managed to drive them out, like Japan did. But
Kinda.
Christianity is it is a religion where the story of Japan and China is not over yet, right?
Right.
So we shall see. Uh, and the mass conversion happening in China, I think, is a good thing. It's not, and the reason I think it's a good thing is that the government very much is not in favor of it. They do not want it to happen. Now, famously, so if you want to know why the Protestants are growing in China and not the Catholics, I can tell you it's not a secret. The reason is that the Catholic Church has been taken over by the Chinese government,
Yep.
with the exception, to my knowledge, of one cardinal, Cardinal Zin, if I'm not mistaken, who is a heroic man and probably a saint. Uh, like he is probably going to end up a Saint Cardinal Zin, even
Yes.
if not officially canonized like he should. Uh, Shamefully, the Vatican has completely abandoned the Chinese cardinals. Most of them have knuckled under the Chinese government, and the Chinese Christians want no part of that, so they don't join the Catholic Church.
Yep.
In a weird way, this is an optimistic thing. The optimism here is that they see the control by the government and they want Christianity, but they don't want that.
Yep.
Right? So there is some optimism to the growing Christian community in China. It's not controlled by the government. It's not government mandated. And you remember too that converting the government means something very different now than it did in like the Middle Ages, right? Or
Yep.
the early, because when you converted the government in the Middle Ages, you were converting the royal court,
Yep.
right? These were actual people who you could hold accountable. You know, nowadays it is like a mass of faceless bureaucrats.
Yes.
It's not the same thing,
Yep.
right? Like if you convert, Charles Martel to Christianity, then Charles Martel baptizes all of his men. You just converted the Franks,
Yes.
right? And that's just it. But in communist China, there is no one man who you go to and go like, well, if you convert him, the whole country will follow. Uh, I suppose there is in a sense of like, yeah, I guess if you converted Stalin, that would have been a pretty big deal.
Yeah.
Uh, but Stalin wasn't going to get converted. He was a man who had hardened his heart,
Yep.
uh, right? Who had let his heart be hardened. The situation was very different than what you saw in that era of European history. So I think it's a good thing that what we're seeing right now is that the Christian movement in China is largely underground, because
Yes.
that should tell you that that's largely sincere. That and the fact that Christians are being persecuted in China. Remember, China, to their quote unquote credit, is an equal opportunity like they're equal opportunity in their anti-religion, right? They hate
Yes.
the Muslims too, probably more than the Christians actually. Uh, they really hate the Muslims.
Oh yeah.
The thing is, yeah, of course, the thing is that unlike with the Christians, their reasons for hating the Muslims are every time large groups of Muslims get into power, they tend to try and subvert the government and violence breaks out. And there's a point to that. Yeah, like that isn't entirely wrong.
Yep.
Uh, it's probably not entirely fair either. Like, I don't want to make out communist China as the good guys in this story, but it's probably not entirely wrong. Their
Yeah.
hatred of the Christians is, yeah, we don't trust them. Their way of life isn't compatible with our way of life, and that is also true. Can you hear me? My phone was moved away for a bit.
Yeah. I can hear you now.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, like our way of life isn't compatible with their way of life, and that is also true. So in a sense, they're not really wrong about like why they should be distrusting either side. But yeah. So all of this is to say, let's see what happens with China. I don't think that you can just assume that the upward trajectory is going to stay at this level,
Yes.
but I do think there is reason for optimism.
Yes. And the thing, my point wasn't so much that um, such a thing is or isn't happening in China, but rather how people use and talk about it. Um, because it's difficult for people to really understand the scale of what needs to be done and what should be done. Quite frankly, besides prices, how much has the government, the evil and wicked government we have right now, how much does it actually affect your life that wasn't happening under other presidents? Quite frankly, outside of the prices going up, nothing has really changed that, you know, I can say is a special kind of evil or anything like that. Like there's like some people say, oh, this is this or that, or it's the dispensationalist times. Israel is reforming itself and all this other nonsense. But it's pretty clear that times haven't actually changed. Nothing ever happens. What is happening in a real sense is that there are a lot more Christians talking to each other and going, oh, we got to do something about this. Where previously that didn't actually happen. Everyone was comfortable. Everyone sought their personal peace and affluence to their heart's content. And it's hard to really comprehend how much personal peace and affluence tamps down on the spiritual life. Jesus has many harsh words to say about rich men. And even the apostle, even the epistles and whatnot, make sure to, don't let the rich bully the poor, sort of thing within the church. If some people show up feasting and drunk, when it comes to, communion, that's bad. Don't do that. That's not what this is about. Uh, it's pretty clear that having no need of anything and not God does not create a rich spiritual life the same way as being poor in spirit does. Uh, but now that that rich and affluence is going away, uh, you know, people are being priced out of homes. There's all kinds of weird shenanigans going on. Everyone knows that Bill Clinton was going to be on the Epstein files. No one actually cares that they're going, oh, look at it now. He's on there. He's John Doe, number 57. Secret, ooh, John Doe 57. You were all wondering about, it's like we already knew. We always knew. We knew day one. We knew before to get day one, quite frankly. Uh, and people in Arkansas knew before then.
Mm.
It's very frustrating because it's like, it fools some people. It fools a lot of people, and especially boomers and people who are in the kind of the angry, oh, did you know stage of conspiracy theory. But the average person doesn't actually care. They still came to the bar I bounce at and drank themselves silly when the weather permitted. You know, like the life continued on, even if the internet was going crazy. But quite frankly, dead internet or fake internet theory is getting stronger by the day. I can't even say that all the uh, Twitter accounts and whatnot that I see are real. The same way with like if you go on like YouTube Shorts, a million cat videos, and then you start seeing the same cat video uh, on different like aggregated into different collections. Like There's real life and then there's not real life, and it turns out real life has been going on mostly the same. Um,
Hmm.
and it's hard to make an argument that it's not the same, because I'm looking at it and I'm pretty sure it's the same. So the question then is, what should people do? Not form a militia or anything like that, though one should always practice self-defense. Not form some sort of weird, easily federated entity, but rather the goal should always be, the next generation, making sure that you're basically pumping out little Uber. No, 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 no. Don't say the Ubermensch word, Ben. But pumping out little Christians, uh, who will continue it on with that. What will happen is that God will raise up those who are intended for greatness. From our study of great men in the different great men streams we've had, God put his hand on these people, and their natural qualities were manipulated into such a way that made them great. Whether it's their sheer ambition, or whether it's their cleverness, or bravery, or, ingenuity and all that jazz. Anthony and I were talking about Edison and whatnot. The man was brilliant, and the greatest part of his brilliance was that he brought other brilliant men under him to make things that could be used by the general public. Tesla may have had some absolutely wacky and wild ideas, that were leagues and heads and shoulders above things that we can do today, or maybe not, or maybe so. Um, Certainly some of his things like pulling electricity from the air itself. If you're high enough in the atmosphere, people just don't do that, even though they, it's weird that you can do that if you're careful. But at the same time, it's like you can't really fly a drone 24 hours a day up in the air to take a certain amount of electricity on top. Who knows if it's even worth it? I don't know the amperages or the voltages. Uh, at so, there's inspiration there beyond the mortal ken that brought these men to ideas that fundamentally changed uh, how we live our lives. There's a line before Edison and then a line after Edison. Uh, with just like there's a line in our own lives, pre cell phones, post cell phones. Um, Unfortunately, as individualism kind of dies off by necessity, because people need to help each other more and more, I think there's going to be a lot more opportunities to work with people across different aisles, in ways that work out. But as I'm speaking, I'm thinking of like Franco. In the end, Franco pulled together an alliance of right wing, Catholics and even Spanish Nazis and all this jazz, fascists, and got backing from Germany, and other things like that, and took over his country. And then he sent the most extreme radical right wing of his country to fight for the Germans, even though he himself didn't really participate in World War II. So he did have his alliance of right wingers, uh, who crushed the left wing, but when certain elements became too dangerous, he let them leave, to fight for Germany. Encouraged it even. All the time, his speechwriters, were putting in "Viva Cristo Rey" and everything, about it. You know, we won't. People believe, yeah, if I make 8 kids, we'll take back this country, buddy. In the time it takes you to make 8 kids, they brought in 100,000, a million even, illegal immigrants who all can vote. You didn't do anything. You know, in reality, there's some certain balance between, pushing away the world and letting in who and letting in the world to witness to those who are still in the world. And, like we said earlier in the stream, you can't send out your kids as missionaries, to public schools or anything like that. They will be corrupted. But at a certain point, you do need to be teaching those kids how to witness to others, how to speak to others, how to keep their heads when somebody brings up, oh, Christ wasn't born on Christmas. But it's like, that doesn't change anything. But maybe he
Yeah.
was because of how the timing for how the timing of John the Baptist's birth is. It's I'm trying to get to my point because it's hard because it's a complex idea. Like we need to make children. It is good to make children. It is bad, Anthony, uh, that you and I are not building clone facilities to pump out 1 million soldiers for the Grand Army of the Republic. To fight the. Wait a minute, I'm
I'm
talking about
sorry. I
Star
want
Wars
to
again.
do the. I'm thinking of the Breaking Bad meme, the Jesse. What the F are you talking about?
It's a malady of the Gen Y. I went too long without mentioning Star Wars, and I was talking about clone troopers. But at the same time, like the bodies aren't going to be what wins the war. What's going to win the war is create quality, absolute quality. Having a library, educating your children. The reason why I can speak about things of the spiritual nature of art and all this jazz is because I spent time uh, listening to my parents and getting educated about things and really believing it. You know, with all the information that's available, especially to do with health, to do with like I've got right next to my chair, I've got Yukio Mishima's The Sailor Who Fell from Grace with the Sea. On the other side, I've got Lycurgus, who was a good anon and a good Twitter account. Heredity and Fire, and then I've also got Schopenhauer's On the Will of Nature, and I've got some wafer rolls. Mm. And I've got Less in Colorado, whatever his name is, Selective Breeding and the Birth of Philosophy. There's ways to create and keep things burning. And I'm looking over to my left, and there's my library of science fiction and fantasy and history and art. And I'm going to try my hand at other types of art as well. Um, Soon, I'm going to go to conscious. I'm going to fill my life with the good, the beautiful, and the true. I'm not going to spend it watching cat videos on YouTube or watching TMZ dramas or Marvel TMZ about the superheroes or about, sports ball teams, even though, I'm not going to knock it. You do need that camaraderie. But at the same time, there's obsession and then there's obsession. There's fandom and then there's obsession, and I'm not going to spend it watching romance dramas or court dramas or reading romance novels and court dramas. I'm going to, be of the quality that I wish I could see in the world around me. And what will happen is that when I have kids, much as my father's focus on Jesus Christ was passed on to me, I can not only focus on Jesus Christ, I can bring out more than uh, what myself had. I can bring out the exercise and the high mindedness. I could take education and make it better for my children. I would not just be um, I would not be creating a carbon copy of myself. I would be seeking to better the generation ahead. And maybe that will mean something. Because several people, including Bronze Age Pervert, have been very clear that breeding will not do anything at this time. Having more kids is itself not a strategy. I agree. Because the benefit of, our own civilization, of the Christian ethos, is to create quality children who know the true and living God. It's education of kids isn't spare the rod, spoil the child. It's, to be an approved worker, not ashamed of the gospel of Christ.
Yep. I, I do think if you were to ask me the best thing that any individual person can do, I think live a life of virtue is the answer.
Yes.
I think you got to be careful in what you say, right?
Yep.
Where like I don't think the answer is get married, have children.
Right.
Which is somewhat controversial in the Christian world. Caitlin says, "Leave Anthony alone, Ben."
No.
That made me laugh. Okay. Anyway, I don't think that the answer is get married, have children, which I know is a somewhat controversial thing in the Christian world. Like, don't you, like I don't understand. Don't you think that Christians should get married? Well, I don't know what you Protestants think over in your world, but in my Catholic world, uh, in my Catholic world, Jesus Christ said that it's better to be celibate than married.
Did
No,
he?
really though. Like, in all seriousness, I'll try and put this in a more in a more logical, laid out way than than a Catholic versus Protestant antagonistic style. Uh, so I think that saying that the best thing that any individual person can do is get married and have children isn't quite right. I think there's some truth to that. You're getting to a truth, but I think that you haven't hit on it. The actual answer is to live a life of virtue, and sometimes that does not involve having kids. In fact, the higher way would be to not have children for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. Now, there I will pause here. For the sake of the kingdom of heaven is a point. If you are somebody who wishes you could be married and have kids and you don't, you are not committing some sort of heroic sacrifice, right? You just are lonely. Uh, there is a difference,
Yep.
right? There is a big difference between. I hate using this word. It's a word that was made up by feminists who attack men, but it is also accurate. An involuntary celibate, right?
Yep.
An incel, which is probably the majority of men. That's just how it is.
Yep.
Uh, Being involuntarily celibate versus being celibate for the kingdom of heaven are two very different things. If, however, you decide to be celibate for the kingdom of heaven, that is not only just as worthy as having a family with lots of children, it is, God considers it a greater sacrifice. So live a life of virtue, and sometimes that will not necessarily mean that you should get married. Now, if you do get married, then you are obligated to live the married life to the best you can. That will involve being fruitful and multiplying. Uh, Jesus Christ brings marriage back to Genesis. That is how he kind of that's kind of how where he roots it in Genesis. So being fruitful and multiplying, having children, raising them as best you can, doing that in the way that is conducive of good Christians, that's what you could do. But the flip side here is Catholicism is somewhat notorious for having very few married saints comparative to religious saints. I think this is overblown. One of the reasons for this is that the good that you do, and this is the reason that it's better to be unmarried. If you have a family, your first priority is to your family, to bring your wife and secondarily your children, primarily your wife, and the wife primarily your husband, and secondarily your children to heaven, right? That priority is very important. Keeping that priority accurate is very important. Counterintuitive, but important, right? Your priority is to your spouse, and then secondarily to your children, and then only after that the world. So a lot of good men aren't going to be like Canaanized saints, because what they're doing is going to be, well, I raise a good family who raised good children who brought their values into the world, right? That's not the makings of a Canaanite saint. The ones, however, who do become canonized saints, I'm thinking off the top of my head, the parents of Saint Teresa of Lisieux. They became canonized saints. Why did they become canonized saints? Well, for one thing, their daughter was Teresa of Lisieux, so they raised a child of extraordinary virtue. And in fact, all of their children actually ended up going into religious life. So that's one reason. They raised a family who cared an incredible amount about uh, their eternal souls, prioritized it to the exclusion of all else, and they raised a child who uh, became one of the most influential saints of the 20th century. You have, I can't remember her name, which is a shame. She's a great saint. She's like the pro-life saint. She died giving birth to her child. She could have had the child aborted, and probably, by the way, it would have been morally acceptable due to the principle of double effect. Like, it might have been something, I forget exactly what it was. Saint Gianna Moretta or something? Saint Gianna Molla? I think that's her. Yeah, Saint Gianna Beretta Molla. I'm right. Okay. Uh, so during her pregnancy with her fourth child, she died in childbirth. Now, she probably could have gotten at least a hysterectomy or something that would have ended up killing the child and would not have been technically immoral. But she chose a heroic action in dying for her child's life, and she was canonized for it. So, Saint Gianna Beretta Molla. Uh, but this is going to be rare. The fact of the matter is, if you choose to have a family, you are choosing to prioritize the salvation of that group of people who you've been entrusted with over the salvation of the wider world. And that is not to say that it isn't a great thing. It is, but being celibate for the kingdom of heaven is an even greater thing. So, in short, this just goes back to what I was saying originally. The absolute best thing that you could do is live a life of heroic virtue,
Yes.
right? That's the thing. That's the thing you could do. That's how you can help the world the most, in however that looks. If that means of heroic virtue could mean that you end up becoming a priest or a religious. It could also mean that you get married and you sacrifice and slave away for your wife or your husband and your children. But either way, it requires you to have absolute faith and towards in Jesus Christ, and to live your life with charity in trying to do His will in all things. You know, the married saints who ended up getting canonized, they tend to fall into one of two categories. They either did something extraordinary, like Gianna Beretta Molla, who died for her child, and this ended up becoming really helpful in like the zeitgeist because pro-life issues became really big. So her canonization was kind of politically helpful, which is not to say that I don't think she deserves to be canonized. I absolutely do. In fact, Saint Gianna Beretta Molla is one of my favorite saints. But the reason that she specifically got canonized because it was a politically helpful canonization. That happens a lot. It's just how it goes.
I knew it.
Uh,
I
or
knew it. No. We got it on recording, folks. We got him.
of course, well, like in all seriousness, this isn't to say. So I want to make a distinction here between being politically motivated and being undeserved are two different
Yes.
things,
Oh,
right?
I know. I
Like
know. I.
it's a very different thing. I think her
Yes. Yes.
canonization was absolutely deserved. Like I think 100% her life story is inspiring. I think the way she died, uh, literally, like it brings a tear to your eye to
It
read
does.
to read how she died. People were telling her like, kill your child, basically, kill your child. It
Right.
will save your life. They told her, hey, here's a way to do it. Like if you do this, it's technically not immoral. If you get remove like I think it was something with a fibroma on her uterus as I'm looking it up. Like, hey, if you do that, the principle of double effect, you could live for your other three children. And she refused. She wouldn't do it. Uh, and she gave birth on Easter Sunday. It's heroic, but it was absolutely like pro-life is in the news. You want to have a pro-life champion. Saint Gianna Beretta Molla fits the bill, right?
Yep.
So he goes through the canonization process in 2004, and beatification in 1994.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, my point being that how you live that life of heroic virtue will differ depending on who you are. But I would say that people should consider the idea that perhaps their calling is not marriage. That if it is marriage, that you need to live in marriage as virtuous of a life as you can, but perhaps it isn't. But also to remember this distinction that not being married when you want to be is not the same as living your life as a celibate for the kingdom of heaven.
Yep.
Not the same thing. Okay, go ahead, Ben.
Incapability isn't virtue, and I think
Yeah.
that's a good way to put it. You know, a life of heroic virtue. Uh, you know, we're not called to be cowards. You know, Christian cowards. There's a verse I particularly like. Uh, says that we should be wise as serpents but harmless as doves. People look at it and go, yeah, serpents, wise as serpents and harmless as doves. That means I should be, you know, non-violent, you know, ready to be martyred at any second, you know, willing to give up everything just because I might have a twinge of conscience. You know, not an actual twinge of conscience, by the way, a worldly invoked twinge of conscience. You know, and it's, you know, and it's not actually living. You know, one of the reasons why, you know, people like Bronze Age Pervert and others who are not Christian, you know, who should be locked up in a dancing cage and poked with a stick to show, you know, the true end of Nietzschean philosophy is that who has power? Well, it's the guy who locked you up and is now poking you with a stick. Quote some philosophy for me, please. Is this okay? Uh, you know, is you know, they argue for, you know, a sort of heroic vitalism, you know, a virtue of the body and of the mind, you know, to pursue action and to celebrate life. You know, quite frankly, the Christian should be the one who celebrates life the most. You know, there's what are those lines from, you know, A Christmas Carol, you know, where, you know, who, you know, this guy nobody celebrates Christmas better than, you know, Scrooge's nephew or you know, Bob Cratchit or I can't remember the line. I had it in my head a second ago. You know, but it's like you know, keep a certain spirit. You know, Tiny Tim at the church praying, you know, on his little crutch, you know, so that he hopes he reminds you know, the people of how lucky they are, because Tiny Tim is pure sugar injected right into your heart. You know, I tear up simply to mention him. Uh, but the life of heroic virtue
Sure.
is the best way to. Tiny Tim was a stroke of genius, pure glurge. Even not,
What's
he doesn't
the
even
famous
blink.
Wilde quote? The Oscar Wilde quote: "None can read of the death of Little Nell without laughing."
No, he is a heartless man and a homosexual. The
He heard it on his deathbed.
all right. Uh, well, people laugh at his final quote anyway.
Yes.
Uh,
Well, yeah, but was he either the wall goes or I do?
no, his is oh, and he uses the f word because he was saying something and then he got hit with the morphine that was to ease him on his way, and he went, "Oh, you know," uh, and so he has a very funny set of last words there. Um,
Yeah, there are some good ones like some of and also by the way, this is slightly off topic. I'm gonna let you finish, but I want to get to this. Sometimes those famous last words of people like Voltaire, for example, like Voltaire's actual last, you'll sometimes hear Voltaire and people go like, "Ha, what a badass" or whatever, because Voltaire said something like, I don't know, so like a priest came and asked if he renounced the devil, and he said something like, "Now is not the time to be making enemies." And
yeah,
it's like, oh, what a badass. But when you actually read the full account of like Voltaire's last moments, it's actually horribly sad.
yeah,
Like Voltaire realized that he was going to hell and he was terrified.
Yep.
And
And
it's like, yeah, he did make a joke in his final
no.
moments. I hope that God found it funny.
Yeah. Any, hmm,
Yeah.
hmm. But the choice to live a life of heroic virtue is the choice that every Christian should make. The choice to hit the gym, the choice to, go out of your way, to, be a Christian and be willing to, pay the costs for a lot of this stuff. Because quite frankly, it was never the gift of salvation was certainly free, but our cost before the world isn't.
Yeah. No, I got nothing to add there. Uh, there is a sense where like the the best that we could do is only our best, right? On one
Mm-hmm.
hand, but on the other hand, as Christians, we don't need to accept that anymore,
Yep.
right? Because the best we can do is no longer our best. The best we could do is God's best.
Oh
Uh,
yeah.
because with human beings, this is impossible, but with God, all things are possible.
Yep.
So there, there's no longer like it reminds me. I've been reading. If you've read a series of unfortunate events years ago, we've discussed it on stream before, right?
Oh yeah.
Uh, and I am a fan of Lemony Snicket and the series of unfortunate events. It's a good book, but it's a fascinating book. It's essentially the book, like when you really boil it down, the philosophy of the series is that of a moral but godless man floundering, looking for meaning and finding none. Right? Like that's really what's going on throughout all of the Snicketverse books. He's godless, but he is moral. Like he believes in good and evil, but he doesn't know. He has no way of grounding it, no way of finding like what's right, what's wrong, what's good, what's bad. So he's floundering the whole series, right? This is why when you get to the final book, the ultimate message of the series is nobody really knows what the ultimate message is. The best that we could do is our best, and sometimes our best is not going to be enough, but
Mm-hmm.
it's also the only way that anything will ever improve. Because human ingenuity and human uh, goodness is all that you can count on in this world, right? This
Yep.
is why in the famous final scene of the end. So, and this I think this is a tangent worth going on. In the famous final scene of the final book in the end when Count Olaf dies, right? The
Mm-hmm.
end is a much maligned book, but Olaf's death scene is one of the best scenes in the whole series. It's a final twist of the knife from Olaf as he dies of this absolutely horrible human being, right? Who is unrepentant and who is certainly going to hell. Uh,
Oh yeah.
and who accepts this pretty much, right? He is unrepentant. He does one last good deed before he dies, but he does it with no expectation that it will lead to any sort of redemption or reconciliation. He does it because he wants to do it and for no other reason, right?
Mm.
And in a way also to upend the expectations of the Baudelaires, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like just to put a another last twist to the knife in the chest of the Baudelaires. There's this great scene where Klaus and Violet and Sunny confront Olaf and they finally accuse him of setting the fire that killed their parents. And Olaf has been the villain of the entire series, and he's been characterized basically as just an unrepentant, excuse my language, bastard, right? Like
Yes.
he is an evil, unrepentant bastard. That's the character of Count Olaf in the stories. And he has shown pride in admitting when he's killed people or burnt buildings to the ground. And he openly hates the Baudelaires and their parents.
Mm-hmm.
So you would think if he killed them on his deathbed, he would brag about this. And instead, what he answers is that what you think? You don't know anything. And then Kit Snicket says a snippet from a poem next to them. And Olaf twists the knife one last time by quoting a poem by a poet named Philip Larkin. It's fascinating that this is the poem that Snicket picked, or Daniel Handler picked, because if you actually read the full poem, it is full of curse words. Like, it's a nasty poem. It's a poem worthy of Count Olaf. But he only quotes the final line. So Kit Snicket, the character of Kit, is giving birth next to them. And Olaf's last words are, "You're not the only one who can quote the words of our associates," referring to people in VFD, the organization they're in.
Yep.
And he looks up and he says, "Man hands on misery to man. It deepens like a coastal shelf. Get out as early as you can and never have any kids yourself." It is a chilling final line from
Mm-hmm.
Olaf. But more importantly, it is the final great twist. Because if there's been one thing throughout the series that Snicket has made clear, or that he's wanted to make clear, it's that libraries, education, reading, these will be the things that save you. And then Olaf, in his dying moments, reveals, "Nope, I'm educated too. I too know the words of our associates. I can quote poetry. I know literature."
Yep.
And then he dies. So even that won't save you. And that's ultimately like the message of the end, right? It's like,
Mm-hmm.
so what will save you? Well, we don't know. I don't think it's fair to say that Lemony Snicket is a nihilist. He never excuses Olaf for his actions, right?
Yep.
Olaf is a horrible person. It's very clear that Olaf is a horrible person. When the Baudelaires do morally questionable things, it's not excused on the grounds of, "Oh, it's okay because there's no such thing as good and evil." It's instead just questioned as like, "Well, what would you have done?" Right?
Yep.
And isn't that like, this is what a godless man has to work with, when you don't have that higher power, when you don't have a hope in a being greater than yourself, you're stuck with fallible humans trying to make decisions the best they can and constantly failing, and you
Mm-hmm.
will always fail. Humans can't do it on their own. uh but we're not working on our own, right? We have God that we're working with, so we know that in the end we won't fail, right?
Yep.
It's just an interesting thought. Like, I thought a lot about it. I've thought, first off, a lot about that ending, because that scene with Olaf's death is brilliantly written and I think brilliantly done, and about the philosophy of a series of unfortunate events, and the prequel, the even better prequel series, All the Wrong Questions, which is in the style of a film noir. Uh, Really, really good book series, by the way. If you haven't read it,
Yep.
I highly recommend it.
I need to
But
reread the series personally, ignoring the existence of the Netflix show, but not the movie.
I will strongly disagree. The Netflix show was much better than the film.
Eh.
The Netflix show was good. The movie was all right. I mean, it's not the worst thing I've ever seen.
I agree with you, Anthony. Like, there's something that gets me. Speaking quite frankly, is that the lackeys that everyone gets distracted by. You can. I've always been. Whenever Henry Kissinger died recently, and he was still making pronouncements of power and, you know, guiding things. Tony Blair still guides English, uh, still guides English politics. The idea, the idea that these people who everyone gets distracted over, the Richard Hanayas, the Neil deGrasse Tysons, the little minions, who get in everyone's hair and trips everyone up. I've never you make responses to them on Twitter and stuff like that because it's fun and easy to dunk on them. But then you think about it for a bit. Did Henry Kissinger even have a Twitter account? Tony Blair has one, but it's clearly just a publication announcement piece. There's another group that is perfectly willing to burn all this down for their beliefs. Uh, and they're clearly educated. They're clearly smart. They clearly know how to wield political power. Um, Even if their minions squawk and squabble, Clown World's rulers still are in control. Thinking about this thing we're talking about with Count Olaf, which is a truly dramatic scene. It makes me feel like we're dealing with like the real challenge isn't that these idiots will be thrown from their high horse. Idiots have always been thrown from their high horse. It's that the real rulers of the world will be stuck with them. Nobody's going to go crazy and go crazy and do something violent. Nobody's going to really do that. Who isn't like a wind-up toy for the FBI? So we just kind of have to wait for these surprisingly long-lived people to die off. Um, I don't know what Henry Kissinger's last moments were like, but the man had such evil on him that who knows? And then you think about men like Tony Blair and others. They got their power from somebody, and they'll probably have somebody they'll have to give power to. Same with George Soros and the Rothschilds and others. And it's how to deal with them because they're often very educated. They often fund art. They're not the ones who do. Many powerful people use art as a tax write-off, but at the same time, that's not everyone. Uh, I don't know. It's just one of those things where it's like thinking about what you've just quoted for Count Olaf and the other stuff makes me feel like there's no matter of education for it. There's only the working of the Holy Spirit and only the working of God to allow us to be conquered by these villains. For our own wickedness, of course. And as much as
Yeah,
I'd like to say something like art, redeems life or something like that, I know I've never believed that to be true. And I can't fake believing it's true either. But I know that
no,
that's
art doesn't life.
right, right.
There is the only redemption is in Jesus Christ, right?
Yes,
But
exactly. Well, sorry.
and I mean that
I'm, yeah,
very seriously.
no, and I completely agree with you. But what I'm saying is that there's you're quoting of Count Olaf's death, a character in a children's book, is has made me maudlin about the fact that so much of what we do is distracted by things like Epstein lists and stuff like that when we knew 4 years, whatever it was, however many years ago, and before and all this
The whole
jazz.
the whole Epstein list thing is a complete joke. They're
Yeah,
totally pointless. They will lead to nothing.
yeah,
Everybody knows it, right? Like
yeah.
it's just yet another one of those things where that's out there. Bread and circuses distract us. Do you want to mention one other thing? I do think that that quoting of Count Olaf, you're right. There's something important there about bringing art to this. I mentioned before the stream that one thing I was thinking of talking about was "It's a Wonderful Life," and we settled on this kind of far-reaching conversation, starting with the Benedict option. But
Mm.
there's something notable about mentioning, I think, and this is a good way. We're near the end of the stream now, so it's a good place to close it out. I think. Uh, there's something notable about bringing up "It's a Wonderful Life" here. So, first off, "It's a Wonderful Life," as far as films go, like my opinion of it has only gone up over the years. When I was
Mm-hmm.
younger, I would have told you that I thought, and I mean like really young, like middle school or whatever. I would have told you it was a fine movie. It wasn't great. As I got older, I would have. The older I've gotten, the more I've appreciated it.
Mm-hmm.
I now think "It's a Wonderful Life" is an absolute masterpiece. Like
Yes.
in terms of ranking, like best Christmas movies ever, I don't really even consider it a discussion. I think it's obviously It's a Wonderful Life. Like, to be frank, I don't really think that there's any other movie that is in the discussion for best Christmas movie ever with It's a Wonderful Life, because It's a Wonderful Life is among the greatest works of art in the modern era. Right? It is a
Yep.
absolute masterclass in writing, in filmmaking, in acting, in everything, and the depth of It's a Wonderful Life. The thing that stands out to you as you get older and you watch it is that the message of the movie is so not simple, right? Like, it's
Mm-hmm.
so not what you would expect it to be. You know, George, why does George live a wonderful life? It's impossible not to be moved by the ending. The ending is an incredibly moving scene. Uh, it's very hard to watch and see George's brother come in, and he says to my brother George, the richest man in town. It's hard to watch that scene and not feel emotional over it, right? It's
Mm-hmm.
such an incredibly well done, moving scene, but it does raise the question of, like, okay, but why, right? Like, what happened here? Nothing's really changed. And I watched a recent review and analysis of it from a channel that I highly recommend. I don't know if it's a new channel, but it's a channel I newly discovered called Empire of Mind. Very, very good videos. I recommend them. He did a video on It's a Wonderful Life. Uh, and in the analysis, he pointed out that in order for George to reach the point where he could be essentially, literally redeemed by his friends, like, redeemed in a monetary way, as in, like, they literally paid money to redeem him, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, to reach the point where George could be redeemed by his friends, he had to also reach the point where he could say, I'm going to jail. Isn't that wonderful? Right? He had to reach a point where he saw his life as it was, not before, right, redemption had made its way, not before grace entered in, right, but
Mm-hmm.
just where it was, and saw how the grace had already been interacting with it, and recognized that, and then this redemption scene could happen. He had to realize that, okay, I'm going to jail, but there is so much about my life that is already so valuable to so many people that, who cares, right? It doesn't matter. you know like, all of these things that wouldn't have happened, these things that wouldn't have changed. It's a Wonderful Life because George realizes that he was trying to find meaning. Like, he's really quite similar to Mr. Potter, right? He wants to
Mm-hmm.
become rich and fame, and he wants to travel the world and make money and live this adventurous life, this high rolling life. And he couldn't do that. He can never do that. So it becomes like a battle of, so what's really important, right?
Mm-hmm.
George is going to war with himself the entire movie over what is more valuable in your life. Is living this life of adventure more important, or is living the life of someone who is a good neighbor and a good friend and a good husband and is loving and charitable? Is that what's more important? This is all represented, of course, in the person of Mary, and it's why the phone scene is one of my absolute favorite scenes in all of cinema. This is the scene where Sam Wainwright calls Mary and offers George a job. If you remember this scene, George is walking out in the snow,
Yeah.
and or at night, and while they're celebrating his brother having recently gotten married, and he has just learned that he thought he was going to leave town, but he's not, because Harry just accepted a new job offer, so he's trapped in Bedford Falls still. And Mary lures him into her house. And this scene is literally like that war of George, right?
Mm-hmm.
Inside George's heart of family life, friendship, small town like values and community values versus the allure of adventure, right? Of money, of exotic locations. And it is made very clear in the film that when George decides to stay with Mary, which is the choice that he ultimately makes, he is making a sacrifice, right? Like,
Yes.
he's giving something up. Capra, the director, he comes out on the side of family life, but he doesn't do it by sugarcoating it. He doesn't go like, and family life is this wonderful, happy-go-lucky thing. No, George is angry. He's shaking Mary because he's realized that all of his dreams, he's about to throw them away, and it's like, and for what? For Mary, right? Like, who represents Bedford Falls. He's going to throw it all away for Bedford Falls. You know, and it's worth it, but it's not easy. So I think that is, in a sense, in It's a Wonderful Life is kind of the opposite, right, of that philosophy of, Count Olaf, it's a series of unfortunate events where it's like, who knows the answer? What is the answer? And It's a Wonderful Life is like, well, yeah, you're going to go through all of these things. You're going to live a series of unfortunate events, right?
Mm-hmm.
Are going to happen to you. They're going to follow you throughout your life. And what's going to make your life wonderful is realizing and being grateful for the grace that abounds there, right?
Yes.
It's kind of the antidote to a series of unfortunate events because, in a sense, that is what George is going through. He's going through this constant series of unfortunate events. These bad things are constantly happening to him, and he's constantly making sacrifices for them. But that's not where the story ends.
Mm-hmm.
That's where a series of unfortunate events ends, because that's where it has to end. Because the author does not have an answer without God. But there is a God.
Mm-hmm.
And so you can't end the story there. And that's where I will stop.
Yep. I like the idea of living a virtuous life, a heroic life, a heroically virtuous life. And I hope the rest of you join me in doing so. Thank you all
Yep,
for
and It's
listening.
a Wonderful Life. Yeah, just one last thing. It's a Wonderful Life is a really good example of this as well, right?
Exactly. Thank you all for joining. Have a wonderful evening. Come again soon.